Welcome to Late Night Horror Stories and True Crime. Tonight, we dive into 3 real-life cases where true crime meets the supernatural: possession, assault by unseen forces, and an unsolved death steeped in occult whispers. These stories are not for the faint of heart. These stories are not fiction. They contain graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing events. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Turn down the lights, lock the doors, and prepare yourself. Brookfield, Connecticut, 1981. The winter air was sharp, a biting wind cutting through the small New England town. Inside a modest apartment, a man lay dead, his blood pooling beneath him, soaking into the cheap linoleum floor. His name was Alan Bono, a landlord, a friend to many, and standing over him, knife in hand, was Arnie Cheyenne Johnson. Johnson's breath came in ragged gasps, his body rigid, his eyes wild. The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in around him. The weight in his chest was suffocating. He hadn't wanted this, he hadn't chosen this, but the thing inside him had. The police arrived within minutes, the scene unfolding in surreal stillness. They found Johnson outside the apartment, his hands stained red, his expression blank. He looked at them with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. Then, in a whisper so quiet it almost went unheard, he spoke. "He made me do it." The story of Arnie Cheyenne Johnson's descent into horror did not begin that night. It started months earlier, with an 11-year-old boy named David Glatzel. David had always been a nervous child, prone to night terrors and fits of fear that his parents dismissed as childish imaginings. But the summer of 1980 brought something new, something darker. The boy woke screaming night after night, his voice raw with terror. He spoke of a figure, a dark shadow that lurked in the corners of his room, whispering things he didn't understand, making promises and threats in a voice that curdled his blood. His parents thought it was stress, a phase, but the phase never passed. David grew gaunt, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. His family members reported that he spoke in strange voices, voices that did not belong to an 11-year-old boy. Objects moved in the house, doors slammed shut with impossible force. One night, David's mother, Judy, found him clawing at his own skin, his face twisted in agony. "It wants me," he whimpered, his voice trembling. By autumn, the Glatzel family was desperate. They turned to the only people they thought could help: Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous paranormal investigators. The couple had handled countless hauntings, countless possessions, but what they encountered in the Glatzel home chilled them to their core. According to the Warrens, David was not simply afflicted by a mental disturbance, he was possessed. The exorcism was violent, unlike anything they had seen before. The boy screamed, his body convulsing, his eyes rolling back in his head. The entity fought back with ferocity, and in a moment of reckless defiance, Arnie Cheyenne Johnson made the mistake that would seal his fate. "Take me instead," he had shouted into the darkness, and the demon had listened. At first, nothing changed. Arnie felt fine, relieved even. He had saved the boy, he had won. But then the dream started. Arnie would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He saw flashes of something, a darkness that reached for him, something that curled around his mind and whispered vile things. His temper grew short. He lashed out at his loved ones, then at strangers. His fiancée, Debbie Glatzel, noticed the changes first. She spoke of his blank stares, the way his hands would tremble when he thought no one was looking. the way he would mutter to himself as if arguing with an unseen presence. Then came the blackouts. Hours would pass, and Arnie would have no memory of them. Debbie would find him outside, standing motionless in the cold, his eyes vacant. And then there was the voice, low, guttural, speaking in tongues no one could understand. Debbie begged him to get help, but by then, it was already too late. February 16th, 1981. It should have been an unremarkable day. Anna and Debbie had been spending time with Alan Bono, their landlord, a friendly man who enjoyed their company. They had been drinking, laughing, sharing stories. Then, without warning, everything shifted. Anna's body went rigid. His breathing turned shallow. His eyes darkened, the pupils dilating until they were nothing but pits of black. Debbie screamed as he lunged. The knife in his hand moved with unnatural precision, striking over and over, blood spraying across the walls. Alan Bono didn't stand a chance. By the time Arne came back to himself, the damage was done. Alan lay at his feet, his body torn apart. Arne's hands shook as he looked down, the knife slipping from his grip, clattering to the floor. The police found him minutes later standing outside, staring blankly ahead. He offered no resistance. He did not fight. He only whispered, "He made me do it." The courtroom was packed. The press called it the "devil made me do it" case, a sensationalized spectacle of faith versus law. Arne's attorney made history by attempting to argue demonic possession as a defense, a first in American legal proceedings, but the court refused to hear it. The judge dismissed the claim outright, stating that possession had no place in the legal system. Arne was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, though he would serve only 5. His supporters argued that he was not to blame, that something darker had gripped him that night. The Warrens stood by their claim. Arne had been possessed. Skeptics dismissed it all as superstition. And yet, late at night in the quiet town of Brookfield, whispers still linger. Some say Arne was a man with a violent streak, driven to murder by nothing more than his own rage. Others claim the demon never left him, that it merely grew quieter, more patient, and that somewhere in the shadowed corners of the world it waits, watching, waiting for the next invitation. Culver City, California, 1974. The neighborhood was unremarkable. Small homes built in the post-war boom, sun-faded lawns, the occasional palm tree swaying in the breeze. On a quiet residential street stood a rundown house that bore no indication of the unspeakable horror inside. It was here that Doris Bither lived with her children. And it was here, according to her and a handful of terrified witnesses, that she was repeatedly attacked by an unseen force. She was a woman like any other, bruised by life, a mother clinging to stability. But something in that house, something old, something hungry, saw her differently. It watched her, waited, and when it struck, it did so with inhuman cruelty. This story would become one of the most controversial and disturbing cases in American paranormal history. Not because it was the first of its kind, but because it left behind scars that could not be explained. Witnesses, photographs, and a woman haunted until the end of her days. It began with whispers. At night, Doris would lie awake and hear voices murmuring in her room, low, unintelligible but unmistakably there. She told herself it was the house settling, the wind, a neighbor's television, until the bruises started. Dark splotches bloomed on her arms and thighs, fingerprints that no hand had placed. She would wake with scratches on her back, deep welts along her ribs. Her children, she had 4, asked her what had happened. She didn't know how to answer. Then came the first night. She was in bed, alone. Her children had gone to sleep. The light in her room flickered once, then went out. And, in the pitch dark, something climbed onto the bed. There was weight, an unmistakable pressure, as if a full-grown man were straddling her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her arms were pinned by invisible hands. She felt fingers clutch her wrists, her thighs, felt something breathing against her face. Then came the pain. She described it later as an assault, brutal, violating. When it was over, she wept into her pillow until dawn. She thought she was losing her mind, but the attacks continued. Night after night. The bruises multiplied, her health declined. Her screams began waking the children. They saw nothing, but they heard her cries. Doris went to the police. They dismissed her. She tried a doctor. He offered sedatives. She visited a priest who recommended prayer and warned against unclean thoughts. Desperate, she finally turned to a nearby university. There she found Dr. Barry Taff and Kerry Gaynor, parapsychologists researching paranormal activity. Initially skeptical, they agreed to visit her home and conduct a preliminary investigation. What they found stunned them. The air in the house was heavy, oppressive. Cold spots drifted from room to room. Their equipment malfunctioned almost immediately. And during one of their first visits, in front of the children, Doris screamed and collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing. They watched, stunned, as red marks appeared across her skin in real time. Taff and Gaynor set up equipment, cameras, electromagnetic sensors, audio recorders. For weeks they returned night after night, documenting strange readings and collecting testimonies. One evening, a Polaroid camera captured something, an arc of light above Doris's head, a streak that suggested motion and presence. They snapped dozens more photos. Most showed nothing. But a few, just a few, revealed strange anomalies, glows, fogs, orbs of light hovering near Doris. But they never saw the thing, not directly. It happened during a particularly intense night of activity. Doris had agreed to allow the team to conduct a full, overnight stakeout. The room was set, cameras mounted, lights dimmed. Doris lay in bed under the watchful eyes of the parapsychologists. Her children waited in the living room. It started just past midnight. A sharp crack echoed through the house, like a whip striking wood. The walls shuddered. A cold gust blasted through the room. The lights flickered, then died. Then Doris began to scream. The team burst into the bedroom. They found her levitating off the bed, limbs flailing, her nightgown ripped, her skin flushed with red. Something held her there, suspended like a puppet. And then it was gone. She fell, sobbing. The team tried to comfort her, but she was inconsolable. That night left her broken. Doris came to believe the thing in her home was not one, but 3 entities. One was dominant, brutal, overpowering. The other 2 watched, holding her down. They never spoke, never revealed their faces, but their presence was constant, their intent unmistakable. Dr. Taff and Gaynor tried to help. They brought in a medium. She fled the house in tears, claiming it was cursed beyond cleansing. They recommended that Doris move. So she did, but the thing followed her. No matter where she went, apartment to apartment, even across the city. The attacks continued. Not as frequent, not as intense, but always there. A shadow in the mirror. A whisper in the night. Her children grew up with trauma, etched into their bones. One son later claimed he saw the entity, described it as tall, misshapen, like a man made of smoke. Another became deeply religious, convinced they had lived with a demon. Doris drank. She moved frequently. She stopped speaking of it. And then in 1995, she died alone of respiratory failure at the age of 58. Skeptics dismissed the case as hysteria. They pointed to Doris's troubled past, her drinking, her history of abuse. They said she imagined it all. But those who were there, Dr. Taff, Gaynor, her children, never forgot. They witnessed things they could not explain, saw bruises form before their eyes, heard voices in the silence, and the photographs remain. Faded now, grainy, but haunting. Doris Bither's story was turned into a Hollywood film, The Entity. But the real horror lies not in what was shown, but in what was left behind. Because something touched her, something no one could see, and something perhaps still waits in that empty house on the quiet street in Culver City, waiting for the next voice in the dark, the next prayer unanswered, the next soul to reach out and find only hands in the black. Springfield Township, New Jersey, 1972. The suburbs were quiet, nestled between fading woodlands and winding creeks. Families left their doors unlocked. Kids played until sunset. The American dream bloomed here, modest but secure. That illusion was shattered the day a dog dragged home a human arm. The dog belonged to a family living near the Houdaille Quarry, a rocky stretch of wilderness long abandoned by industry, but still whispered about by locals. Its jagged cliffs and dense trees had long been a hangout for teenagers and transients, a forgotten piece of land that now became the epicenter of something inexplicable. Police followed the dog's trail to the top of the cliff. There, laid out as if on display, was the decomposed body of a young woman. Her name was Jeanette De Palma. She had been missing for 6 weeks. Jeanette was 16. She came from a working-class family and had recently found religion, much to the surprise of her friends. Her conversion was sudden and passionate. She spoke openly about Jesus, about salvation. She carried her Bible everywhere. Some said it was a phase. Others thought she was genuinely seeking peace. She was last seen leaving home on August 7th, reportedly on her way to visit a friend. But she never made it. Her disappearance sparked concern, then panic. Flyers were posted, doors were knocked on, but nothing turned up. It wasn't until the dog came home with that severed limb that anyone realized how close she had been all along. The location where her body was found came to be known as the Devil's Teeth, named for the jagged rocks that jutted from the earth like fangs. Police arrived quickly, but what they saw made some turn away. Jeanette's body was surrounded by strange objects. Branches arranged into symbols, crude wooden crosses, bones that didn't belong to her. Her body was badly decomposed, but there were no signs of animal predation, no signs of struggle, no sign of what exactly had killed her. And no one was prepared to talk about what they saw. The rumors began immediately. Witchcraft, satanic rituals, cults. Springfield was a deeply religious community, conservative, private and wary of outsiders. Many believed something evil had happened on that cliff. Parents warned their children to stay away from the woods. Stores, sold out of crucifixes, and Bibles. Ministers held special services. People prayed. The newspapers picked up the story. Some ran headlines about the possible occult connections. Others played it down, calling it a tragic but explainable death. But the community knew better. Too many things didn't add up. Anonymous letters were sent to the police. People spoke of hooded figures in the quarry at night. One woman claimed to have seen a fire burning on the cliff, shapes dancing around it, chanting. A man swore he found a dead animal, drained of blood, left on his porch. And there was another detail, one the police refused to confirm. Some claimed Jeanette's body was found atop a makeshift altar. Others whispered her arms were positioned as if in crucifixion. The official reports omitted these claims. But the rumors never died. Police interviewed friends, family, classmates. They found nothing concrete. No suspects, no cause of death, no motive. The autopsy was inconclusive. Her body had decayed too much to determine trauma. They ruled out overdose. There were no drugs in her system, no obvious injury, no sign of sexual assault. They closed the case. But questions remained. Why were there occult symbols around her body? Why was no one in town willing to talk on the record? And why, decades later, would so many files about the case go missing? In the 1990s, a reporter named Mark Moran, editor of the magazine Weird New Jersey, began digging into the case. What he found disturbed him. Photographs had disappeared. Case files were incomplete. Witnesses were unwilling to speak, or claimed they had been warned not to. Something, it seemed, had been buried along with Jeanette. In 2002, Moran interviewed a man who had been a boy at the time of the murder. He remembered walking past the Devil's Teeth with friends and hearing screaming. A girl's voice, high-pitched, panicked. They ran home, too afraid to look. His parents told him never to mention it again. Another woman, who had been in school with Jeanette, said they all knew who was responsible. A group of older kids obsessed with black magic. They held rituals in the woods, played with Ouija boards, sacrificed animals. She said they targeted Jeanette because of her religious devotion. She believed in God, the woman said. They didn't. They hated her for it. And then she hung up the phone. Moran never got to speak with her again. The Devil's Teeth remains. Silent. Watching. Hikers who pass through the quarry report unease, a heaviness. Their electronics fail. Their compasses spin. One woman claimed to hear footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, but no one was there. At night, the trees seem to shift. The shadows stretch. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, a voice carries from the cliff. A girl's voice, calling, crying. Local legends say Jeanette never left, that her spirit is trapped where her body was found. Some say she guards against the evil that summoned her. Others believe she became part of it. Teenagers still dare each other to go up there. Most return unchanged. Some do not speak for days. One boy went missing for 4 hours and was later found in the woods, curled in a fetal position, whispering prayers in Latin. He never explained what happened. He refused to go near the Devil's Teeth again. The unanswered questions. Why was Jeanette killed? Was it a random act? A cult ritual? A punishment for her faith? Or was it something darker, something that predates even the quarry, something in the land itself? The answers are lost to time, but the unease remains, the silence of officials, the vanishing records, the stories passed down like warnings. Jeanette De Palma's death is more than a cold case. It's a scar on a town that would rather forget. but forgetting doesn't banish the dark. It only invites it closer. So, if you ever find yourself near the cliffs of Springfield and the sun begins to set, remember her name. Speak it aloud. Because in the quiet spaces, something is always listening, and something, perhaps, is still hungry. Thank you for joining us tonight on Late Night Horror Stories and True Crime. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We'll be back soon with more dreadful stories for your pleasure. Keep the lights low and the doors locked. Until next time, good night.